question, what do you want, is simple in its wording, yet weighty in its impact. It is not a surface level question meant to gather information. It is a mirror held up to the soul. It requires a level of honesty that many people spend their entire lives avoiding. This question cuts past rehearsed prayers, polite answers, and religious language, and it goes straight to the place where desire lives. Demands that a person stop hiding behind what sounds acceptable and begin to face what is real. For many, the challenge is not that they don't have faith, that their faith has been trained to stay safe. They've learned how to ask for what feels reasonable instead of what feels impossible. They've adjusted their expectations to match their disappointments. And over time, they've confused coping with believing. When the question comes, interrupts that pattern, it exposes how often people ask for less, not because they don't want more, because they're afraid of the vulnerability required to admit it. Honesty is uncomfortable because it removes excuses. Once a person admits what they truly want, they can no longer blame silence, circumstances, or other people for staying where they are. The question forces a reckoning between desire and responsibility. It brings clarity to whether someone is waiting for change or participating in it. Many people would rather talk about what happened to them than confront what they still want for themselves. This question also reveals how pain reshapes desire. Trauma and repeated disappointment have a way of shrinking dreams. People stop wanting what they once believed was possible and start wanting only what feels manageable. Stop asking for healing and settle for relief. They stop asking for freedom and learn how to function in limitation. When asked what they want, their first instinct is often to answer with what feels safest, not what feels truest. Yet the power of the question lies in its invitation to truth. It does not shame the listener for their condition, nor does it pressure them to perform faith. It simply creates space for honesty. It allows a person to name the longing they buried, the hope they silenced, and the dream they locked away to avoid disappointment. In that moment, desire becomes visible again. When someone finally answers honestly, something shifts internally. Desire moves from being a quiet ache to a spoken declaration. Once desire is spoken, it begins to awaken faith. The heart starts to remember that it was created to want, to believe, and to reach. The question doesn't just ask for an answer, it restores the courage to want again. Many people remain stuck in the same condition for years, not because change is impossible, but because familiarity has become more comfortable than freedom. Brokenness lasts long enough can begin to feel normal. What once felt unbearable slowly turns into something manageable, and over time, survival replaces expectation. People learn how to function within their pain instead of believing for deliverance from it. They adjust their lives around limitation and call it wisdom, when in reality, it is fear wearing the mask of maturity. There is a subtle danger in learning how to live with what was meant to be temporary. Pain becomes familiar. It starts shaping identity. A person is no longer someone who is going through something. They become someone defined by it. Struggle becomes a story they tell, a role they play, and eventually a place they feel safest. Healing then feels threatening because it would require redefining who they are without the pain that has accompanied them for so long. Comfort with brokenness often shows up in excuses that sound reasonable. People say they are being realistic, guarding their hearts, or avoiding disappointment. Beneath those statements is a quiet surrender. They have lowered their expectations to avoid the risk of hoping again. Faith begins to shrink because belief is gone, but because disappointment has taught them to expect less. They stop reaching because reaching reminds them of what didn't happen before. This comfort also creates resistance to change. Freedom demands adjustment. Healing requires new habits. Restoration calls for accountability. Brokenness, the other hand, requires nothing new. It allows people to stay in familiar routines, surrounded by familiar limitations, supported by familiar explanations. Even when the opportunity for change appears, it can be dismissed because staying the same feels safer than stepping into the unknown. There is also a sense of control in brokenness. Pain that is predictable feels easier to manage than a future that is uncertain. People know how to navigate their dysfunction. They don't know how to navigate wholeness. Wholeness demands growth, responsibility, and courage. Removes the safety net of excuses and exposes the possibility of failure again. So some choose the certainty of pain over the risk of healing. Yet this comfort comes at a cost. While brokenness may feel safe, it quietly steals joy, purpose, and momentum. It keeps people in a cycle of repetition where days pass, Nothing truly changes. Dreams remain distant, prayers remain cautious, and life becomes more about endurance than transformation. What was meant to be a season becomes a sentence, simply because it was never challenged. Remaining comfortable with brokenness is not a sign of strength, often a sign of wariness. It reveals a heart that has been fighting for so long that it no longer believes change is worth the effort. But the truth is, feels comfortable is not always what is healthy. And until comfort is questioned, transformation will always feel optional rather than necessary. Fear has a way of silencing desire long before it ever silences faith. Many people still believe, still pray, and still hope in quiet ways. They are afraid of what will be required if change actually comes. Desire, when spoken out loud, creates movement, and movement demands responsibility. That is where fear steps in. Not fear of failure alone, but fear of what success will require, fear of exposure, fear of becoming accountable for a life that can no longer hide behind excuses. Change threatens the familiar, even when the familiar is painful. Predictability. People know who they are in their current condition. They know how to explain it, defend it, and manage expectations around it. Desire is awakened. It introduces uncertainty. It raises questions about identity, relationships, habits, and priorities. Fear whispers that change will cost too much, that it will disrupt comfort, and that it will require leaving behind people or patterns that once felt safe. Fear often disguises itself as patience or wisdom. People say they are waiting for the right time, seeking clarity, or being cautious. Underneath those words is a reluctance to step forward without guarantees. They want assurance that the risk will be worth it, that the outcome will be secure, that they won't be disappointed again. Fear convinces them that staying still is safer than moving forward, even if staying still means remaining unfulfilled. Another reason fear silences desire is the weight of past failure. When someone has tried before and been disappointed, desire begins to feel dangerous. Wanting again opens old wounds. It reminds them of prayers that felt unanswered and hopes that didn't materialize. Fear tells them that protecting their heart means lowering their expectations. So instead of saying what they want, they say what they can live with. Trade passion for preservation and call it maturity. Fear also resists change because change removes old justifications. As long as someone remains where they are, to circumstances, history, or other people as reasons for their condition. But once desire is spoken and opportunity appears, responsibility shifts. The question is no longer why something hasn't happened, but whether they are willing to respond. Fear does not want that level of accountability, because accountability demands action. This silencing of desire slowly drains life of momentum. When people stop naming what they want, they stop moving toward it. Days begin to blend together and life becomes about maintenance rather than growth. Dreams fade not because they were impossible, because they were never pursued with courage. Fear doesn't always say no. Sometimes it simply keeps people quiet long enough for possibility to pass by. Fear loses its power when desire is acknowledged. Speaking desire does not guarantee immediate change, but it breaks the silence that keeps people stuck. Challenges fear's control and reintroduces the possibility of movement. When desire is no longer hidden, faith has room to breathe and courage has a place to grow. Desire is not merely an emotion. It is a signal that something within the soul is still alive and reaching. When desire remains unspoken, it stays dormant, buried beneath routine, disappointment, and cautious faith. But the moment desire is named, something begins to shift. Speaking desire activates faith because it moves belief from the abstract into the personal. It forces a person to stop thinking about what could be and begin engaging with what they are truly hoping for. Many people believe silently but hesitate to speak openly. They assume faith should exist without words, yet throughout life, transformation often follows declaration. Desire is spoken, it becomes intentional. It marks the difference between passive hope and active expectation. Faith is no longer a quiet thought in the heart, comes a direction. What is named gains focus. What gains focus begins to draw movement. There is power in articulation because it clarifies vision. Till desire is spoken, it can remain vague and undefined. People know they are unhappy, restless, or unfulfilled, but they cannot clearly say why. Speaking desire brings specificity. It answers the question of what needs to change and where faith must be applied. Once clarity is present, faith has something to attach itself to. It no longer floats, it anchors. Naming desire also creates alignment between the heart and action. something is spoken aloud, it demands consistency. Words carry weight and they begin to influence decisions, priorities, and behavior. A person who names their desire for healing starts paying attention to what affects their health. A person who names their desire for purpose becomes more aware of how they spend their time. Faith begins to show up not only in prayer, but in daily choices. There is also a sense of permission that comes with speaking desire. Many people unknowingly deny themselves the right to want more. They feel unworthy because of past mistakes, failures, or seasons of disobedience. Speaking desire challenges that mindset, declares that grace still applies and that the future is not disqualified by the past. Faith grows when a person believes they are allowed to want what was once out of reach. Desire spoken in faith also disrupts stagnation. Silence keeps things as they are, but declaration invites movement. Even if circumstances do not change immediately, the internal posture does. The heart shifts from resignation to expectation. That shift alone begins the process of transformation. It renews motivation, restores hope, reignites the willingness to try again. When desire remains hidden, it can quietly fade, but when it is spoken, it is reinforced. It becomes something to stand on rather than something to suppress. Faith thrives in that space because faith responds to honesty. Once desire is named, it invites response, growth, and action. What was once only a longing becomes a pathway toward change simply because it was given a voice. Many people live their lives anchored to what happened to them rather than to what is still possible for them. When pain, failure, loss becomes the dominant narrative, it slowly positions a person as a victim of circumstance instead of an active participant in their future. Shift from victim to participant begins internally, long before anything changes externally. Starts the moment someone realizes that while they may not be responsible for what happened, they are responsible for what happens next. Victim mindset often feels justified because it is rooted in real experiences. People were hurt, overlooked, betrayed, or denied opportunities. Those experiences shape perspective and influence expectations. Over time, the focus becomes fixed on what was taken, what went wrong, and who was at fault. While acknowledging pain is necessary, remaining there can quietly rob a person of agency. Life becomes something that happens to them instead of something they engage with. The moment responsibility is reclaimed, the story begins to change. Responsibility does not mean self-blame. It means self-awareness. It means recognizing that even within limitation, choice still exists. Participant understands that they have the power to respond, to grow, and to decide how their story continues. This realization restores movement. Instead of waiting for circumstances to change, they begin changing how they show up within those circumstances. This shift also reframes the past. Instead of seeing history as a sentence, it becomes a reference point. The past no longer dictates identity. It informs wisdom. Pain becomes something that shaped them, not something that defines them. When a person sees themselves as a participant, they stop asking only why things happened and start asking what they can do now. Question alone opens new pathways forward. Being a participant requires courage because it removes the safety of blame. When responsibility is embraced, excuses lose their power. Growth becomes unavoidable. Choices matter again. Actions carry weight. This can feel intimidating, especially after seasons of feeling powerless, but it is also empowering. It restores dignity. Reminds a person that their life is not over just because something went wrong. Participation also reactivates faith. Faith thrives when there is movement, expectation, and engagement. A victim waits for rescue. A participant prepares for transformation. They may still need help, support, and grace. No longer sit in paralysis. They begin taking steps, however small, toward change. Each step reinforces belief that progress is possible. This mindset shifts. The present takes on new meaning. Today is no longer just something to endure. It becomes an opportunity to invest. Decisions are made with intention rather than resignation. Hope begins to feel practical instead of distant. The future is no longer a vague idea, becomes something they are actively moving toward. This transition does not erase the past, but it repositions it. The story is no longer centered on what was lost, on what is still unfolding. By stepping out of victimhood and into participation, person regains ownership of their narrative and discovers that their story still has direction, purpose, and